When visual effects companies take on projects from big studios, it's often said that they're jumping out of an airplane without a parachute, and then they have to figure out how to put together all the pieces of a parachute while they plummet to Earth before they hit the ground. That's what they're effectively doing when they take on these contracts without knowing how much it's going to take to do it or even how they're going to do it. All they know is they've got a price, they've got a deadline, and now they got to figure out how to make it work. Well, one of those processes they have to do is called projections, or forecasting how much render and disk space it's going to take. And that's what we're going to talk about here on A Cup of Joe. Please take a moment to subscribe to this channel, and if there's a video that you like, maybe share it on social media and click the like button. So figuring out the render and disk costs of a project can sometimes be the most expensive or the second most expensive part of a project, depending on how large your crew is. Labor is often the largest cost for most big and medium-sized studios, but again, these render and disk costs come in at number 2. And the reality is there's been countless times where I have seen a show double its costs or double the expectation over the life of a show. And I mean double or sometimes even more. Can you imagine if all of a sudden your rent doubled or your mortgage doubled or all of a sudden your paycheck doubled? I mean, these are monumental changes in a model, and yet it happens regularly that all of a sudden it's going to take double the space to get this project done or double the render farm that we thought. So I want to talk to you a little bit more about projections and forecasting and all the challenges that come therein. Whether you're a large studio or a small studio, doing projections and forecasting of your render and disk space needs is essential. You also need to forecast your user base and your licenses. So all of this needs to come together while you figure out how much am I going to need to get this project done. The reality is the techniques that you're going to use if you're a 4-person boutique shop or a 400-person studio are very different. Yet the principles are the same. We need to come up with some method to determine what we expect to use. But more importantly, then you need to do a feedback loop of looking at your actual usage and saying, how is it mapping against our projections? Whether you have a small studio with very simple projection models or very complex large studio models, the idea of comparing the actuals to the forecasting is the key part that brings it all together. So we're going to talk about that. I'm going to give a brief overview in this video, and then based on the feedback that I get, I might do some deep dives into each of these subject areas as future videos. Right now, we're going to talk about the basic principles. I'm going to talk about top-down forecasting, bottom-up forecasting, using a staffing model to figure out how much you're going to need, the importance of frame counts, the render efficiency curves and how to figure out those, importance of data collection, as well as projections and actuals, which I just touched on a moment ago, and I'll be talking about over and over again throughout this video. Let's talk about the basic principles. Forecasting is always inaccurate. No forecast is correct. If you can show me a forecast that's 100% correct, you're probably forecasting after it's already happened. It's going to be inaccurate, and that's okay. Again, an important part here is that you start with a forecast and then you start comparing your actuals later on, saying how accurate is it, and then you're iterating or constantly redoing that forecast over the life of a show. Inaccurate projections are better than no projections. The reality is putting 0 into a spreadsheet for how much you're going to need because you just don't know is the worst thing you could do. So putting something that's the most realistic expectation that you can come up with, even if it's wildly inaccurate, is so much better than just putting a 0 in the spreadsheet for what you need. Finally, it's best to think in core hours. Now, what I mean by core hours, and this is the little bit of math I'm going to throw at you in this, and so bear with me. Core hours are the base unit that most farm usage is measured by. Now, this could be local on-premise farms that studios have, or it could be cloud farms like AWS or Microsoft or Google Procs. However you're rendering, you're likely going to be thinking in the terms of core hours, and this is what a core hour is. So the core hours as a base unit of measurement goes like this. Let's imagine you have a machine with 20 cores on it, and you decide to put a frame on that machine to render. And you're going to give it all 20 cores of that machine. And it renders, and it only takes 1 hour. Well, that means that frame cost you in your studio 20 core hours, meaning it took 20 cores over an hour. So the math starts to bake out, like if it took 2 hours to do that same frame, well then it took 40 core hours because it now took 2 hours on a 20 core machine. Conversely, let's say you're going to put two 10 core frames on that machine. So you're going to run 2 frames at the same time, and they're each going to use 10 cores of that machine. And let's say that they each complete in an hour. Well, each frame took 10 core hours. And that machine still was 20 core hours worth of processing, but now it was split between 2 frames. So when you start to look at farms, you start totaling up the total cores that are available times the number of hours that you have it. So let's say it's 100 of these machines. Well, now you've got 2,000 core hours every hour, right? Because you've got 20 cores times 100 machines. You've got 2,000 core hours to play with every hour. And I'll tell you something about core hours. Every hour for your on-premise farm that you have goes away when that hour is over. So you got 20 core hours to use for this hour, or 2,000 core hours to use for this hour, and then they're gone and you can never use them forever again. So you want to always keep your farm full so that you're always using your core hours when you have an on-premise farm for this reason. A core hour wasted is a core hour you'll never get back. So core hours are the basic unit of measurement to measure capacity. So a frame taking 20 core hours, if there's 100 of those frames, well, again, it's going to take 2,000 core hours to do that job. Now, if you run them on 100 machines at the same time, or whether you run them on one machine for 100 hours, it's going to take the same amount of core hours to complete that. Now, I know that's complicated, but I'll try to talk about that a little more in this video, and I'll probably do a deep dive in core hours in the future. Now that we have those basic principles out of the way, let's talk about those weird projection models I was talking about earlier. Let's start with the top-down model. What do I mean by the top-down model? Well, the top-down model means that you're likely doing this as a manager, as a studio manager, with limited information. But it's like I said, even if you have limited information, it's better to start projecting now, and then as you get more information, you can make it more accurate. So with top-down forecasting, you're basically taking this bidding information that you get from a client or right after you got an award, and all you know is you have maybe 10 small shots, 20 medium shots, 30 large shots, and 10 really, really hard VFX shots or effect shots. So what you'll look to is all the shots you've done in the past and say, let me take a representative small shot that I've done in the past. I know it's going to take X amount of core hours. So I'm going to multiply that out. And then I'm going to say, let me look at how many medium shots I got. Okay, let me find a medium shot that I've done historically. And then I'm going to add that on. And then I'm going to say, how many large shots do I have? I've got 30 or whatever I said. Okay, here's a very large shot that we just did on a show. It's very close. We're going to assume it took this many tens of thousands of core hours. Then you're going to add all those up, and now you know the total core hours that you're going to need for the show. Of course, you're going to stretch them out over the time frame of the show. So if you need X amount of core hours in a 10-week period, or you need X amount of core hours in a 52-week period, well, your per week usage is going to be much different. Again, in the future, I'll go deep into what a top-down projection system is. But another one is the bottom up. This is more common. That last one I said was for large studios that usually have a big slate of shows and a lot of history to go with. But most shops have very little historical information, or small boutique shops will have no historical information. And so they need to create a bottom up projection. The bottom up projection basically is where you take historical averages that you might have kept in the past if you're a larger studio, or you might just create some averages and do some test runs, and then you want to start adding those up per shot. This is again, best bet for small projects or if you don't have any historicals, and you can build it on test renders. And here's how you would do it. You'd say, okay, I have some small shots, some medium shots, and some heavy shots. For the small shot, I expect it to just be some simple 2D rendering, and you run some tests on your little farm, and you say, okay, it's coming in about 2 hours a frame, and I'm going to expect so many frames per shot. I'm going to expect so many passes per artist, and you start stacking those on additively. So you might say, okay, it's going to be another 1,000 core hours for this step, another core hours for this step. Okay, it's going to be times 3 artists. You add all those up, and you say, this is how many core hours it's going to take for a small shot. Then you might do the same process for a medium shot by running some test renders and saying, okay, this is taking many hours per shot, and we're going to expect it to be this many core hours per shot. You're multiplying out some basic test frames just to start with. And again, on those effects and very hard shots, it may be harder to do a test shot that really represents it, but maybe you can pull up an old shot or look at some old renders you did and rerun them and just see what those per hour costs are and how many passes you're going to need to get that shot done. Obviously, a simple 2D shot is going to have far less passes with less iterations than a very complex large shot. Again, this process usually is when, if you're a large shop and you're doing this bottom-up process, it's because you have a very dedicated team of CG supervisors and VFX supervisors who've dived into the schedule and they're really looking at each and every shot. Sometimes studios don't have the resources to really have their team spend weeks doing this, or they perceive that it's not important enough. And so it's the level of detail this is done to is really based on the level of time and energy that the individual supervisors for the show want to put into creating individual little micro estimates and then stacking them all on top of each other. Staffing models are where we use staff counts to figure out how big the farm and disc should be. Now, this can be sometimes regardless of projects because it's based on staff, not projects. It's often good for small shops that have a fixed staff, but they're working on different projects at different times. And a lot of times these smaller shops will even have maybe a second or third machine dedicated to an artist. They maybe don't even have a render farm. They just individually render on their machine they're using primarily and some second and third machines that they've made available to them. And this is the premise on which the staffing model is based. And what I mean by that is you might say, okay, for a simple role, or not a simple role, but a less computational intense role, like say roto, maybe for some roto artists, you're going to allot 1/4 of a machine, meaning to get the average workday done, they need their machine and 1/4 of another machine. And then you might say for the lighters, well, they're going to need 2 machines per lighter or 3 machines per lighter. Now, again, these are going to be farm machines, and it's just a theoretical number. But it's a good one to start with. You know that your lighting artists are going to need way more than your roto artists. So whatever you're allotting, make sure the multiples line up, right? You're going to need maybe 4 or 8 machines per lighting artist or 2 machines per lighting artist, whereas you're only going to need 1/4 of a machine per roto artist. You generally know your staffing counts a little better than your show projections, meaning HR and the studio know how many people they can staff, different types of roles that they can staff at peak, maybe how many they have now. So it's a very easy thing for you to multiply out these per artist role assumptions of how many machines or what portion of a machine they might need per day to get their job done. And when I say per day, I assume they're rendering overnight with these machines as well. Again, the kind of numbers I've dealt with in the past have been on the upwards of a portion of a machine for the roles like roto or maybe even modeling. And then as you get towards animators, it might be maybe half a machine or 1 machine per artist extra. Now, again, I'm saying their primary machine plus a whole extra machine. And then for lighters or effects folks, it can be 2, 3, 5 machines per artist. So you can imagine 100-person crew could easily have 500, 600 machines needed to supply a 100-person crew. That's not a reasonable multiplier. So the idea here is, again, you assign each role a variable of either 1/4 machine, a half a machine, 2 machines, and then you multiply it by your staffing chart and say that's how many machines we're going to need in the render farm. Now, it's a very brute sort of broad average to use, but it's nice to do, for figuring out if you know your staffing models over the next 10 to 15 months, you should assume a farm's going to need to be at least this big to have for an artist crew of that size. And the other thing you can do is start looking at those other projections you were doing, which are more complex. This is a very easy one to do and maintain. You can usually just create a template and paste in your staffing numbers in an Excel spreadsheet, and it just spits out a curve for you. But you can match that curve against your other projections and start seeing how off base you are. It's sort of another way to look at reality. So if you see that your staffing projection curve is 3 times as big as the show projections that you did, those top down or bottom up projections you did, well, then maybe you should be rethinking one of these models is way off and your assumptions may need to be reassessed. I often would maintain the staffing model to check it against the show's projections. As they were feeding me all the data to create these projections, I would have my own staffing model projection that I was running against their show staff to see how close it was lining up. And again, it's kind of like a 3-dimensional image. It's 2 different ways to look at the same problem, so you get a 3D view. So looking at a staffing projection model where you're creating a render and disk space footprint based on the staff size, and then matching that up against your show-based projections that you're doing iteratively with the shows over time is a really great way for a studio supervisor or a studio level manager to see two different ways to look at the same problem. That is, how are we going to have enough farm and disc to keep these shows going? The answer is you won't have enough. That's generally the answer at every studio, is you don't have enough. And that's because a gas will fill whatever container it's given. So if you make the farm twice as big, the farm will fill up to be twice as full with renders. This is a reality that is just almost undeniable. But the flip side of that, I would always say to managers who are complaining that we doubled the farm and filled it right up, is would you like us to double the farm and leave it half empty? Because that seems like a big waste of a farm to me. So I would rather see a farm doubled and filled up right away than doubled and left idle. That's me. I'm a former resource manager, and I like to see my assets get used when I paid for them. Now that's the models. I know it's complex, and really I should do an individual video for each one, but I'd like to talk about some other basic projection principles that need to be kept in mind. The importance of frame counts. It seems very rudimentary when I say it, but the effects of it are monstrous. And what I mean by that is a 20 frame shot will not use nearly the amount of resources as a 200 frame shot. Obviously, yes, I know. Your average visual effects shot runs around 90 frames per shot. And that includes a tail usually, a few frames on the each end for the editors. I've seen a lot of shots go through studios that are 400, 500, 800 frames per shot. The reality is when you look at a show schedule, if there is a couple of those large 500 or 300 frame shots in your schedule, do whatever you can to space them out. In other words, yet another way to look at your show schedule and your resource consumption is to look at the frame counts and make sure that you're not doing too many frames in a particular week or month. I've seen this often overlooked, and I've had to reach out and work with shows I'd walk up to their big magnet board and just immediately see a couple of 500 frame shots in the same week and just say, move those. Like, there's all of your problems right there, having all of those shots in the same week or month. Spreading out the few very large frame count shots on a render schedule will greatly smooth out your peaks and your valleys. And again, a single 400 or 500 frame shot can equal dozens and dozens and dozens of other shots. So all of your other planning will go out the window if you're not looking at the frame counts. This is most known and dealt with in animation, where everything's based on frame count. In VFX, where everyone's just looking at shot counts, this is often overlooked. So this is mainly a message out to the visual effects community to look at your frame times as one of the biggest X factors in your render and disk consumption. Can't stress that enough. Render efficiency curves. Okay, the age-old question is, do you run a whole lot of frames on a single machine and let them take a lot longer, but are you getting more done? Or do you just run one frame on a machine, have it get done really quick with all the cores devoted to that one frame, and therefore you get more done quicker? Well, the reality is there was a time when the more cores you added to a frame, the less efficient it was. Meaning, if you doubled the amount of cores and went from 10 to 20 cores on a frame, it wouldn't run twice as fast. It would run maybe a third faster. And then if you added 10 more cores, it's only going to run maybe 5% faster. So there's this efficiency curve that would dictate why you wouldn't want to put too many cores on a frame. So for most large studios, even though the artists don't always like it, most studios will put a small amount of cores per frame and get as many frames running as they can on a farm. This has been traditionally the way to get the most amount of frames through in a day, even though individual artists are waiting longer for their jobs because they're running with fewer cores. That probably only makes sense to a small portion of you, but that's the reality. It's this efficiency curve. The idea being there's not necessarily, or traditionally was not, a linear increase in speed and efficiency by adding more cores and doubling the amount of cores. But that has changed with Renderman, Arnold. A lot of the newest renderers on the newest machines, you can double the amount of cores and the speed will be cut in half of that frame. You can double the amount of cores again, and again, the speed will be nearly cut in half, meaning it'll run twice as fast. That means that you have near linear effects of adding cores, and this means that a studio now has more flexibility. If you've got a shot that absolutely has to get to the end user, to the director, then you might want to give it all the cores per frame and let that one run through. And in general, keep those core counts down so the most amount of frames are running at the same time. But now it's a little more linear. So figuring out where your efficiency curve is, getting back to the point here, is important. If you find that you run some test jobs at 4 cores and maybe 20 cores per frame, and you're not getting a great increase in speed by adding cores, then run your farm at lower cores. Run your jobs at lower cores. You're going to get more done in a 24-hour period than if you crank up those numbers and run really high core counts on your frames. So there's a real importance about part of your render testing is testing where those efficiency curves are. The importance of data collection. I referenced earlier that larger studios collect their data. If you don't know your past, you don't know your future, right? You need to know what your past usage is per shot. You need to know what's the most amount of terabytes or gigabytes a shot used. You need to know what the most amount of render core hours a shot used, and you need to know how much that is on a per frame basis. Again, if that shot was 500 frames and you're comparing to another shot that was only 20 frames, you're comparing apples and oranges. So breaking down all of these averages down to a per frame average and not a per shot average is so important. Again, it's often overlooked in the VFX world where we're looking at shots as the unit of measure, but the reality is the frame is the unit of measure. And in animation, that's a little more built into the culture. Finally, projections versus actuals. I've emphasized this before, and I can't emphasize this enough. There's no point in doing projections if you're not tracking actuals, meaning if you don't know how much you actually spent, then saying how much you plan to spend doesn't mean anything. You need to know on a weekly or monthly basis, what did we project to use for these shots and what are we actually using? If you don't quite have the studios, if the studio's not quite able to collect all the data so that every last core hour is accounted for, you can at least spot check and say, okay, our assumptions were for an average lighting shot, it was going to be 2 hours a frame. Then spot check, grab a handful of average lighting shots, just take a look at their render times and say, hey, these are running 3 hours a frame or these are running 4 hours a frame. We need to change our projection or we need to change what we're doing on the farm. Most often, to be honest, you have to change the projection. It's rare, not rare, it's less often that the artist community and the creative community can just reduce render times as much as you can simply increase the projection. So no matter what, you need to check your projections against your actuals. You need to figure out what was my assumption and is my assumption true? If my assumption is not true, then do I need to change my assumptions or do I need to change what I'm doing so that it matches my assumptions? It's really up to the creative staff, the CG supervisor and the DFX supervisor and other artists to come up with that answer. But one way or another, you're gonna have to come up with an answer, and it's best that you address it as early as possible. So when you start making early assumptions to do your projections, make sure you're checking it against the actuals throughout the entire process of the show, and that's both disk space assumptions and render assumptions. If somebody is not watching this, it's going to get out of control. You're going to have double the costs, and if you get double the costs on your render or disk, you're likely going to use up the last of your profit. Now you've got a show that's coming in the red. Nobody wants that. So this was pretty complicated. I mean, it's why I did this job for 12 years exclusively, because it takes years to really get to understand all this stuff. So if people have more of an interest on this, please comment below. Let me know in one way or another. And what I'll start doing is breaking down some of these projections and really showing some hands-on tutorials almost on how to go about calculating these projections, whether it's top down and you're just using some basic averages and bidding information, or whether you want to do a true bottom up, which is the best way to do it, and look at every shot type and calculate the total amount of core hours and disk space per shot, and then add it all up and start watching those actuals to see how close it comes. That is the best way to do it. And of course, that staffing model, which is a great thing for a studio manager or a resource manager to have in their back pocket to sort of be a check and a balance against all those other projections coming in and seeing how close they match up. So I hope this helped somebody. Thank you for your time. That's projections, everyone. Cut.